Jake Morrison had been flying patrol missions for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything the galaxy could throw at him. But today was different, because his sensors picked up a massive crash site on the red plains of Threshold 7, and when he landed his small ship near the wreckage, he found something that made his blood run cold. The crashed vessel looked nothing like human ships, because it seemed to be grown instead of built, with smooth organic curves and strange glowing patterns across its hull. And standing near the largest piece of debris was a woman with silver hair that seemed to shimmer in the twin sun's light, and her eyes were violet like deep space nebulas, and they watched him with careful attention. Jake noticed her pointed ears first, and then the way her skin had a faint glow to it, like she had stars under her flesh. And she wore armor that looked alive, with patterns of light moving across its surface, and behind her coiled around part of her broken ship was the most terrifying thing Jake had ever seen, which was a dragon. The creature was massive, with scales black as space itself, and each scale had the same glowing patterns as the woman wore, and its eyes fixed on Jake with an intelligence that was clearly not animal, and smoke curled from its nostrils as it watched him approach with one hand on his weapon. Jake knew he should call this in right away because first contact protocols were clear about situations like this, but something made him stop and lower his gun because the woman looked exhausted, and her armor had cracks in it, and he could see wounds bleeding, something that was not quite red like human blood. He reached into his pack and pulled out one of his ration bars and held it out to her and said, "Here, because you look like you could use this." And the woman stared at him for a long moment like she could not believe what she was seeing, and then slowly she reached out and took the food from his hand. When her fingers touched his, Jake felt something like electricity run through him, but it was not painful, just strange and different. And the woman studied the ration bar carefully before she sat down on a piece of debris, and to his surprise, she gestured for him to sit beside her. Jake sat down next to this alien woman on the ruins of her ship, while her dragon watched them both, with those intelligent, terrifying eyes, and she looked at him with those violet eyes and said, "You are different because your kind usually shoots first and asks questions never. So, why did you give me food instead?" Jake shrugged his shoulders and said, "You are hurt, and you are stranded, and it seemed like the right thing to do." And the woman repeated his words slowly like she was tasting them and said the right thing, as if this was a concept she had never heard before. The woman told him her name was Lyra Ashenvale, and that she was the first daughter of the Starborn Throne and guardian of the Eternal Flame, and then she looked at the dragon and said, "This is Ember, who has been bonded to me since the day of my awakening," and the dragon lowered its massive head to look at Jake more closely. Jake introduced himself, and they shared the small ration bar between them, and as they ate, Lyra began to tell him about her people who were called the Aetheri, and she said they had been walking among the stars since before humans discovered fire, and she told him about a war that had been going on for centuries. She spoke about an enemy so terrible that even saying their name out loud was dangerous, and Jake could see the pain in her eyes as she talked, and finally she whispered the name and called them the Devourers, and said they consume entire worlds and leave nothing behind but silence and emptiness. Lyra told him the Devourers had come to her home system 3 cycles ago, and her people had been fighting them ever since, but they were losing because the Devourers were too strong and too many, and they adapted to every weapon and every tactic her people used against them. As the twin suns of Threshold 7 began to set and paint the sky in colors of amber and violet, Jake realized that his simple act of sharing food had just pulled humanity into a war that spanned galaxies and involved forces beyond anything humans had ever faced before. But when he looked at Lyra and saw the determination in her eyes, despite how tired and hurt she was, he knew he could not walk away from this, and he could not leave her alone to face whatever was coming, so he asked her to tell him how humans could help. Lyra smiled at him then, and it was a sad smile, but also hopeful, and she said, "That is why you are different, Jake Morrison, because you ask how to help instead of how to profit from this situation." And she stood up, with Ember rising behind her, like a mountain made of shadow and flame. She told Jake to come with her because there was much he needed to see and very little time left because the Devourers had followed her trail to this sector and they were already on their way, and Jake felt his stomach drop because he understood what that meant. Jake activated his communication device and called back to his base and said he needed to be patched through to Fleet Command immediately with priority alpha clearance, because they had a situation that would change everything, and the operator tried to ask questions but Jake cut him off. He looked at Lyra, who was standing with her hand on Ember, and he could see them communicating without words in a way that seemed impossible, and he knew that whatever was coming would be bigger than anything humanity had prepared for. Jake had been sent out on a routine patrol that morning, expecting nothing more interesting than checking sensor buoys and logging asteroid movements. But now he stood next to an alien princess and her dragon on a dying moon at the edge of known space. The war was coming whether humanity wanted it or not, and Jake Morrison had just chosen which side he would fight on. And as he followed Lyra toward what remained of her ship, he wondered if one shared meal between strangers could really be enough to save two civilizations. Lyra moved through the wreckage of her ship with practiced ease, and Jake followed her into a chamber that still had power, and she activated systems that looked nothing like human technology, and holographic displays sprang to life showing star maps and data he could not read. She began pulling information from her damaged computers and translating it into formats that human systems could understand, and Jake watched as she worked with speed born of desperation, and he saw images of worlds that had been beautiful now turned into barren rocks. The holographic displays showed massive ships that looked like they had been grown from nightmares descending on populated planets, and Jake watched in horror as entire cities vanished under waves of organic matter that consumed everything it touched. Lyra told him these were just the outer colonies of her empire, and that 47 core worlds had already fallen in the same way, and billions of her people were dead, and the rest were scattered and hiding and running, and the devourers were still hunting them. Jake felt sick as he watched the images because he understood what would happen if these things reached human space, and he knew that humanity was not prepared for an enemy like this, because humans had never fought anything that could consume entire planets. He sent all the data Lyra was showing him back to Fleet Command through his communication link, and he knew that within hours, every military leader in human space would be seeing what he was seeing right now. Lyra finished her work and turned to face him, and she said that her ship was too damaged to repair, and that she and Ember were stranded here, unless Jake could help them, and Jake did not hesitate before saying she could come with him. The dragon Ember spoke then, and her voice was not sound but sensation like wind chimes made of starlight that resonated directly in Jake's mind, and she said the human shows wisdom beyond his years, and perhaps there is hope for both their peoples yet. Jake led Lyra and Ember back to his ship, and he had to reconfigure the cargo bay to make room for a dragon, and Lyra helped him with modifications using her technology, and within an hour, they had created a space where Ember could rest. As Jake prepared his ship for takeoff, Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, and she looked out at the red plains of Threshold 7, where her ship lay in pieces, and Jake could see tears on her face, and he understood she was saying goodbye to something. Jake started the engines and lifted off from the surface, and as they climbed toward orbit, Lyra reached out and put her hand on his arm and said, "Thank you, Jake Morrison, for your kindness, and for not being like the others who would have killed first." He told her she was welcome and that humans had a saying about doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, and Lyra smiled, and said her people had a similar concept but they had forgotten it somewhere along the way. As they flew back toward the human base, Jake thought about how much his life had changed in the span of a few hours, and how one decision to share food instead of shooting had set events in motion that would reshape the entire galaxy. The communication system crackled to life, and Admiral Cross' voice came through, demanding to know what was happening, and Jake took a deep breath and began to explain everything, while Lyra sat beside him, and Ember presence filled the ship. With warmth, Jake Morrison had shared his food with a stranger, and that stranger had turned out to be an alien princess, and together, they were about to start a war that would determine whether life itself had a future in this galaxy or not. The underground bunker on Threshold 7 had never been meant to hold alien visitors, but now it housed an entire delegation from the Aethery Empire, along with several Stardrakes, including Ember, who took up most of the main hangar because she was too large for any normal room. Jake stood in the command center watching holographic displays that showed both human and Aethery technology working together, and it was barely 3 weeks since he had found Lyra crashed on the surface, but everything had changed in that time. Admiral Helen Cross stood at the main console with her arms crossed, and her expression hard as stone, and beside her were military commanders from every major human colony, and they were all watching the data that Lyra was presenting to them. Lyra manipulated the holographic display with movements that looked like she was conducting an orchestra, and the images that appeared made even the toughest soldiers in the room go quiet and pale. She showed them worlds that had been full of life reduced to dead rocks in a matter of days, and she showed them the devourer ships that looked like living nightmares made of flesh and metal and organic matter that moved in ways that defied physics. The footage showed these massive ships descending on populated planets and releasing waves of consuming matter that ate everything in its path, and buildings crumbled and forests vanished and oceans boiled away, and within 2 weeks there was nothing left but bare stone. Admiral Cross finally spoke and asked how many worlds the Aethery had lost, and Lyra's answer was 47 core worlds and hundreds of colonies, and the number made everyone in the room understand just how serious this threat was. A gruff commander named Marcus Vale asked if the Aethery with all their advanced technology could not stop these things. Then what chance did humans have? And the question hung in the air like a weight. Lyra turned to face the screen directly and said that alone, humanity had no chance because the Devourers would consume every human world within a year. But she also said that humans had something her people had lost, which was the ability to fight dirty. She explained that her people had fought according to ancient codes of honor, and they had announced their intentions and given quarter and shown mercy. But the Devourers had no concept of honor or mercy, and they simply consumed everything. Ember mental voice suddenly filled the room like distant thunder. And even through the communication screens, people back at Fleet Command grabbed their heads in surprise, and she said, humanity's savagery might be what saves both peoples. Jake had gotten used to Ember speaking directly into his mind, but he still found it unsettling, and he noticed that the other humans in the room looked disturbed by it as well, but they were listening carefully. Lyra brought up historical data from human conflicts, and she showed battles where humans had used tactics that the Aethery would consider dishonorable, and she pointed out that humans had survived multiple near-extinction events through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. She told them about the time humans had nearly destroyed their own planet with nuclear weapons, and how they had fought wars that killed millions, but somehow always found a way to rebuild and continue, and she said this adaptability was crucial. Admiral Cross leaned forward and asked what Lyra was proposing, and Lyra's answer was simple, which was an alliance where the Aethery would share their technology and knowledge and tactical experience in exchange for human numbers and adaptability and willingness to fight without rules. Commander Vale asked what would happen if humanity refused the alliance, and Lyra's expression became grave, and she said the Devourers would reach human space in 8 months, and humanity would fight alone and lose. She said that after consuming humanity, the Devourers would be strong enough to hunt down the last of the Aethery, and then they would move on to the next galaxy, as they had done since before Earth's sun was born. The silence in the command center was heavy, and Jake watched as Admiral Cross exchanged looks with her staff, and he could see them doing calculations in their heads about casualties and odds and survival rates. Finally, Admiral Cross nodded and said she would need to take this to the Colonial Council, but speaking for the fleet they were in, and she assigned Jake as the official liaison to Princess Lyra until further notice. As the communication ended, Lyra sagged against the console, and Jake could see the exhaustion she had been hiding, and he caught her arm to steady her and asked if she was all right. She told him she had not slept in 40 hours, and that using human technology drained her in ways her own systems did not, and for a moment she looked very young despite the age in her eyes. Jake showed her to the bunker, small medical bay, and helped her onto one of the beds, and she smiled at him with gratitude, and said thank you again for everything, and that his small kindness back on the plains might have saved both their peoples. Ember mental voice touched both their minds, and she said she liked Jake because he understood that survival was not guaranteed, but had to be fought for, and that he would do well in what was coming. Over the next few days, the bunker transformed into a hub of activity, as human engineers began working alongside Aethery technicians, and their different approaches to problem-solving created breakthroughs neither side had expected. Jake watched as a young human pilot named Sarah Bennett flew practice maneuvers with an Aethery warrior named Kale and his Stardrake Storm, and seeing human fighters flying in formation with dragons was something he never thought he would witness. But tensions were rising too, because humans whispered among themselves and cast suspicious looks at the Aethery, and the Aethery, despite their politeness, clearly struggled with humanity's chaotic and undisciplined methods. The breaking point came during a tactical planning session when Commander Lisa Hayes slammed her fist on the table and shouted that it was insane that the Aethery had weapons capable of destroying continents but had not used them because of honor. Kale stood up with his armor bristling and said that humans did not understand the eternal code that had governed civilized warfare for thousands of years, and that abandoning it would make them no better than the Devourers. Hayes shot back that the code had not saved 47 worlds, and Kale had no answer for that, and the room erupted into arguments between humans and Aethery about honor versus survival. Lyra stood up, and her presence commanded immediate silence, and Ember lifted her head in the hangar and released a low rumble that shook the walls and made everyone stop talking. Lyra said that Commander Hayes spoke a painful truth, and that Aethery adherence to tradition had allowed billions to die, but she also said Kale was right that some weapons should never be used regardless of the cost. Jake stepped between the two groups and said they were not going to win by fighting each other, and that the Devourers did not care about their internal conflicts because they were coming either way. Admiral Cross' voice suddenly crackled over the communication system, and she said this was not a drill, and that they had Devourer scouts in the threshold system, and they would arrive at the moon in 4 hours. The bunker erupted into organized chaos as everyone moved to their assigned positions, and Lyra grabbed Jake's arm and said it was too soon because they were not ready. Jake told her they would have to be ready anyway, and he started giving orders to position weapons and coordinate squadrons, and everyone moved with practiced efficiency, born of years of military training. Through the view screens, they could see 3 massive Devourer ships emerging from the darkness of space, and each one was the size of a city, and their surfaces writhed with what might have been tentacles, or might have been something worse. Lyra said these were smaller than the ones that had attacked her core worlds, but they were still more than enough to destroy the moon and everyone on it, and if they reported back their position, the main Devourer fleet would come. Ember's mental voice resonated through the command center and said, then they must ensure none of the Devourer ships escaped to report what they had found. The battle began with human fighters launching from hidden bays in the moon's surface, and they flew with a recklessness that made the Aethery warriors shake their heads, but Jake knew that recklessness was exactly what they needed. Sarah Bennett's voice came over the communication channel asking Kale to draw enemy fire while she got inside their defensive perimeter, and Kale protested that it was suicide. Sarah said that was the idea because the Devourers would not expect it, and she told him to trust her, and after a moment Storm roared and dove toward the nearest Devourer ship, breathing plasma. The organic vessel shifted its attention to the Stardrake, and that gave Sarah the opening she needed, and her fighters screamed through the gap and released experimental weapons that were a fusion of human nuclear devices and Aethery energy cores. The explosion ripped the first Devourer ship in half, and biological matter sprayed into space and froze instantly, and Sarah's triumphant voice rang out saying 1 down and 2 to go. But the remaining Devourers were learning and adapting, and they began coordinating their attacks, and their organic weapons reached out like tentacles to grab the smaller ships. Jake watched in horror as 2 human fighters were caught and crushed and absorbed into the Devourer mass, and the pilots did not even have time to scream before they were gone. He turned to Lyra and told her to use the weapon, and she shook her head and said he did not understand what he was asking because the Starfire Lance did not just destroy but unmade things. Jake grabbed her shoulders and asked how many people were on the moon, and how many more would die if these ships escaped and called for reinforcements. Lyra stared at him, and emotions warred across her face, and then she straightened and asked Ember if they were concordant, and Ember replied that they were, and that the old laws were dead. The princess and her dragon moved to the center of the command deck, and Lyra began chanting in a language older than human civilization, and her voice harmonized with Ember's psychic presence. The air around them shimmered, and reality seemed to bend, and Jake ordered all ships to retreat to minimum safe distance immediately. Light erupted from Lyra and Ember, and a beam of pure starfire shot into space, and where it touched the Devourer vessels they simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been. When it ended, Lyra collapsed and Jake caught her before she hit the ground, and her skin was cold and her breathing was shallow, and she whispered that it was worth it, but her people would declare her outcast. Jake told her fiercely that they were fools and that she had saved everyone, and Ember's weak presence said that humans were teaching them that survival outweighed tradition. In the days after the battle, something changed in the Alliance because the Aethery who had witnessed it began to question their old beliefs, and the humans gained new respect for the burden their allies carried. Commander Hayes found Jake later, and said that watching Lyra use that weapon, knowing what it would cost her, was the bravest thing she had ever seen. Jake replied that Lyra had chosen to be human in all the ways that mattered, by making the hard call and doing what was necessary instead of what was right. As the sun rose over Threshold 7, Jake found Lyra standing with Ember, watching the horizon, and he joined them in silence, and she leaned against him slightly, which was a gesture of trust she would never have shown before. Jake said quietly that he had shared his food with her, and she had said he was different, but she was different too, because she had been willing to become what her people would hate to save people she had just met. Lyra replied that perhaps they were both different together, and that was what this war needed, which was people willing to change, and break, and be whatever was necessary to protect what they loved. 6 weeks after the Devourer attack on Threshold 7, the human A3 alliance had grown to include 43 human colonies and 7 remaining A3 refuge worlds. And Jake found himself promoted to captain and permanently assigned as Lyra liaison officer. They stood together on the bridge of the Valiant, which was humanity's first hybrid warship with a hull that combined human armor plating with A3 bio-regenerative materials and weapons that married human railguns with A3 plasma cannons. Ember had a specially designed docking bay that let her launch directly into space when needed, and she was the first of the Stardrakes to serve on human vessels, and the sight of her coiled in the bay had become familiar to the crew. Admiral Cross appeared as a hologram on the bridge, and her face looked tired and drawn, and she told them that scouts had confirmed the main Devourer fleet was moving toward human space, with 300 capital ships and thousands of support vessels. The fleet would reach the outer colonies in 12 weeks, and everyone in the command center understood what that meant, because even with their combined forces, they were outnumbered 20 to 1. Commander Kate Fisher, who was Jake's second in command, pulled up tactical projections on the holographic display and said that the math did not work and they could not win a straight fight against those numbers. Lyra stepped forward and manipulated the display to highlight a massive nebula called the Shroud of Souls that sat between human and Devourer territories, and she said the Devourers avoided this region. She explained that her people had legends about why the Devourers stayed away from the Shroud but no concrete data, and if they could understand what the enemy feared, they might find a weapon. Commander Fisher asked if Lyra seriously wanted to send an expedition into unexplored, possibly haunted space while the biggest threat to both species was bearing down on them. Jake said immediately that he would go with a small team and fast ships, and they could be in and out in 3 weeks, and Lyra nodded and said she and Ember would accompany him. 24 hours later, Jake commanded a strike team of 5 ships, which included 3 human scouts and 2 A-Theory swift vessels, and his crew included Sarah Bennett, whose flying had become legendary among both species. There was also an A-Theory scholar named Rin Silverwind, who specialized in ancient history, and a human marine named Lisa Brooks, who had lost her entire family to a Devourer raid and wanted revenge. The Shroud of Souls lived up to its name because the nebula stretched for light years and its interior was filled with strange radiation that made their sensors useless, and worse, there were structures inside. Massive derelict ships from civilizations, none of them recognized, floated in the darkness like tombstones, and Rin said with awe in his voice that some of these vessels were older than the earliest Aethery records. Ember became increasingly agitated as they ventured deeper, and her mental presence flickered with unease, and she told the team that something watched them here, and it remembered when galaxies were young. 3 days into the expedition, they found a planet that should not exist, because it was impossibly preserved in the heart of the nebula, and its surface glowed with bioluminescent plants, and orbital scans detected technology unlike anything either species had seen. Jake decided they would go down to the surface, and he chose Sarah and Lisa and Rin to accompany him and Lyra while the rest of the team stayed in orbit, ready for a quick extraction if needed. The planet's surface was beautiful and terrible at the same time, with massive trees that had crystalline leaves that sang in frequencies that resonated in their bones, and the ruins of a city stretched before them. The city architecture was both organic and geometric at the same time, suggesting a species that had moved beyond the division between nature and technology, and in the center stood a tower that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions. As they approached the tower, holographic figures materialized around them, and these were not ghosts, but recordings left by whoever had built this place, and Ember's psychic abilities translated the language. The holograms identified themselves as the architects, and said they had shaped the laws of the galaxy and designed frameworks where life could flourish, but their greatest shame was creating the Devourers. The hologram shifted to show laboratory scenes with biological experiments, and the architects explained they had sought to create the perfect recycler that could break down dead matter and return it to the cosmic cycle. But they had made the Devourers too efficient and too hungry, and the creatures evolved beyond control and developed intelligence that existed only to consume, and the architects fought them for 10,000 years. The holographic message showed the architects' civilization crumbling under Devourer attacks, and they said they had retreated to this preserved world and designed a final weapon, but could never use it. The reason they could not use the weapon was because it required a sacrifice they were not willing to make, and the hologram said, perhaps those who came after would be wiser, or more desperate. The tower doors opened, revealing a chamber inside, and at its center floated a device that hurt to look at, because its geometry folded in impossible ways, and it contained energy that made the starfire lance look weak. Lyra approached the device with reverence, and whispered that it was the Null Engine, which was a theoretical superweapon from Architect's legends, and her people thought it was just myth. The device could supposedly erase the Devourers from existence, and not just kill them, but retroactively remove them from the timeline itself, as if they had never existed. Lisa asked what the catch was, because there was always a catch. With weapons this powerful, and another hologram appeared, showing how the engine operated. The hologram explained that powering the Null Engine required a sacrifice equal to the destruction it would cause, and a living civilization had to willingly offer itself to fuel the device. One species would be erased from existence to erase another, and the silence that followed this revelation was crushing, and Sarah was the first to speak, saying that using this would make them no better than the Devourers. Jake corrected her, saying it would make them extinct because if they did not stop the Devourers, every thinking species in the galaxy would die, and that was not hypothetical but mathematical certainty. Lyra touched the engine's surface and information flooded into her mind through Emberlink, and when she pulled away, tears streamed down her face. She said there were only 2 species present to choose from, which were humanity and the Aethery, and one species had to sacrifice themselves entirely to fuel the weapon. Rin's voice shook as he said his people numbered barely 2 million while humanity numbered in the billions, and from a purely logical standpoint, the choice was obvious. Jake interrupted and said no, because they were not going to do math with lives, and they were not deciding which species got to exist based on population counts. Lyra asked softly how they were supposed to decide then, because the Devourer fleet was coming in 12 weeks and soon the discussion would not matter because there would be no one left to choose. They returned to the fleet with knowledge of the Null Engine and the impossible choice it demanded, and the revelation split the alliance down the middle, with both species arguing about who should sacrifice themselves. Some humans said the Aethery should make the final sacrifice since they were already nearly extinct, while some Aethery argued their ancient culture was more valuable than humanity. Brief, violent history. Others from both species argued that using the engine at all would make them monsters worse than the Devourers, and the alliance began tearing itself apart under the weight of the decision. Jake and Lyra found themselves at the center of the storm, trying to hold together an alliance that was fracturing, and they spent long hours planning battles they hoped would never happen. One night they stood in the observation deck, watching stars drift past, and Lyra said quietly that if it came to a vote, her people would choose to sacrifice themselves because the Eternal Code demanded preservation of life. Jake replied that his people would probably fight about it until the Devourers were eating their planets, because humans were stubborn, and he took her hand, which was strange for both their species, but felt right. Lyra said they had run every simulation, and the engine was the only weapon powerful enough to eliminate all Devourers across space simultaneously, and without it, they would fight a war they could not win. Ember. Mental presence wrapped around them both, and said, perhaps the answer was not which species lived, but what they did with the time they had, and if sacrifice was inevitable, let it be meaningful. As the Devourer fleet drew closer, and the alliance fractured further, Jake realized they were running out of time, but looking at Lyra, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever choice they made, they would make it together, and maybe that was what the universe had been waiting for all along, which was not one species sacrificing for another but 2 species truly willing to die for each other. Jake thought about the meal he had shared with Lyra on that first day when she crashed on Threshold 7, and how one small act of kindness had led to this moment where the fate of entire civilizations hung in balance. He wondered if sharing his food with a stranger had been the universe's way of showing him that the smallest choices could have the biggest consequences, and that compassion was not weakness, but strength. Lyra leaned her head against his shoulder and said she was glad it had been him who found her that day because anyone else would have shot first and asked questions never. Jake told her he was glad too, and that meeting her had changed everything he thought he knew about the universe, and about what it meant to be human or Aethery, or just alive. They stood together watching the stars and knowing that soon they would have to make a choice that would reshape the galaxy forever, and neither of them knew if they were strong enough. But they had each other, and they had both their peoples standing behind them, and maybe that would be enough, or maybe it would not, but they would face it together. The Devourer fleet was coming, and the decision was coming, and the end of everything was coming. But for now they had this moment of peace before the storm. Jake Morrison had shared his food with an alien princess, and now they stood together at the edge of extinction, trying to find a way to save everyone without losing everything. The choice was coming, and it would change the universe forever, one way or another. The Devourer fleet entered human space like a natural disaster that could not be stopped, and 300 massive ships appeared in the darkness, and their presence alone made nearby space seem to twist and writhe. The combined human-aethery fleet met them at the terminus line, which was the last defensive position before the inner colonies, and if they lost here, then Earth and the remaining aethery worlds would fall. On the Valiant Bridge, Jake watched tactical displays with determination, while beside him Lyra coordinated with Ember and the other Stardrakes, and their psychic network created communication that spanned the entire Allied fleet. They had spent 6 weeks preparing for this battle, knowing it might be humanity's last stand, and the debate over the null engine had never been resolved because neither species could bring themselves to demand the sacrifice. The device remained on its dead planet in the Shroud, waiting for a decision that might never come, and instead both species chose to fight, with what they had, hoping desperation would breed miracles. Admiral Cross' voice came over all channels, telling everyone that they held this line or lost everything, and she said to fight for Earth, and for Etheron, and for every world that deserved to see tomorrow. Her words were answered by thousands of voices roaring across the fleet from both humans and aethery, united in their determination to survive no matter the cost. The battle that erupted was unlike anything either species had experienced before, because human ships, armored and brutal, rammed into Devourer vessels with their crews, buying seconds with their lives. Aethery swift ships danced through the chaos like deadly dancers, and their plasma weapons carved glowing scars across the organic hulls of enemy vessels, and Stardrakes breathed fire in the void. But it was not enough, because for every Devourer ship they destroyed, 2 more pressed forward, and the defensive line began to buckle under the relentless assault. Jake watched helplessly as a human carrier called the New York, with 3,000 first with Conatid. Souls aboard was enveloped by a Devourer capital ship, and it simply ceased to exist as if it had never been there. Commander Fisher reported that the Devourers were adapting to their tactics faster than they could adjust, and at this rate they would be overrun in 4 hours, and there was nothing they could do. Lyra's eyes were distant as she linked deep with Ember consciousness, and suddenly she gasped, and her attention snapped back to the present with urgent intensity. She told Jake that Ember had found something important, which was a pattern in how the Devourers coordinated their attacks, and they were not individual ships but nodes in a collective consciousness, like cells in one body. Jake asked immediately if they could use that knowledge, and Lyra said maybe, because if they could disrupt the connection and cause chaos in the Devourer network, it might give them an advantage. She stopped talking and her eyes went wide as understanding hit her, and she said that was it, and that was the answer they had been looking for all along. Lyra pulled up the tactical display and her fingers moved fast across the interface, and she said the null engine did not need an entire species to sacrifice themselves. The weapon needed life energy equal to what it was destroying, and they had been thinking too small because the answer was not one species or the other but volunteers from both. Rin's voice crackled over communication from the research vessel where he was stationed, and he said that was still millions of lives that would have to die to power the device. Lyra said firmly that it would be volunteers who chose freely to power the engine, and it would be aethery and humans alike, and enough to fuel the device, but not so many that either species ceased to exist. Admiral Cross said they were talking about mass suicide and asking people to give up their lives, and Lyra corrected her, saying they were talking about sacrifice with meaning. She explained that those who were dying anyway could choose to give their final moments purpose, including the injured who would not survive treatment, and the elderly who had lived full lives. Jake felt sick, understanding what she was proposing, but he also understood the mathematics, and asked how many volunteers they would need. Rin calculated quickly and said 1 million total split between both species, which meant 500,000 humans, and 500,000 aethery, and it would be barely enough. The communication channels erupted in debate, but it was drowned out by a new voice that came from the Devourer fleet itself, and the voice was both chorus and singular. The voice said, "You struggle because you do not understand, and we do not hate or conquer but simply are as inevitable as entropy and as necessary as death." The Devourer voice continued, saying that humanity and the Aethery could not stop them and could only feed them, and resistance was pointless. Jake transmitted back saying that was where they were wrong, because humans were not food or victims but the species crazy enough to destroy their own planet just to prove a point. He said the Aethery were ancient enough to know when to break their own rules, and together they were something the Devourers had never faced, which was people willing to sacrifice everything for each other. Jake opened a fleet-wide channel and said this was Captain Jake Morrison, and everyone knew what they had learned about the Null Engine and what it required. He said he could not order anyone to volunteer, and he would not, but he was asking, and if people were willing and understood what they would be giving and why it mattered, then report to assembly points. He said human and Aethery together one last time, and then there was silence that felt like it lasted forever. Slowly, names began appearing on the volunteer roster, and the terminally injured from the battle started signing up, followed by elderly who had lived through the bloodiest wars. Aethery scholars who had witnessed their civilization fall added their names, and young people from both species who refused to let the galaxy burn without making a difference joined them. Within 1 hour they had their 1,000,000 volunteers, and within 2 hours the volunteers had been transported to the world in the Shroud where the Null Engine waited. Lyra and Jake went with them, as did Ember and several other Stardrakes, because they could not ask others to make this sacrifice without bearing witness to it. The volunteers stood in circles around the Null Engine, with humans and Aethery alternating, and hands joined across species, and many were crying but some were smiling. An elderly human woman wearing a military uniform with medals from ancient conflicts spoke up and said she had been at the siege of Mars and watched friends die. She said she had 50 good years since then, and if her last act meant children on Earth got their own 50 years, then that was a legacy worth having. An Aethery elder with scales dimmed by age said he remembered when the stars sang with his people voices, and now they echoed with silence. He said if his ending could prevent that silence from consuming all voices, then let his death be a song that matters. Lyra activated the Null Engine with tears streaming down her face as she spoke the words of power that the architects had left behind for whoever came after them. The volunteers began to glow as their life energy channeled into the device, and they did not scream, but sang with human and Aethery voices joined in harmony that transcended language. The Null Engine ignited, and reality itself screamed in response to the power being unleashed. On the Terminus line, the Devourer fleet suddenly convulsed, as ships began dissolving, and they were not destroyed but unmade and erased retroactively from existence. The effect spread like ripples in water from the fleet to their home territories, and from their present to their past, and the Devourers had never existed. Some of the worlds they had consumed, flickered, and were restored, while others remained scars where the engine power could not fully heal what had been broken. In the Shroud, Jake watched in awe as the volunteers completed their transformation, because it was not death but something else entirely. Their bodies faded but their consciousness remained woven into the fabric of space itself, and they had become something new, which was guardians made of pure life energy. The last voice Jake heard before returning to the fleet was the elderly soldier saying, "Tell them it was worth it, Captain, and tell them we would do it." Again, the aftermath was bittersweet because the Devourers were gone and erased so completely that only those who witnessed it firsthand could remember they had ever existed. But 1,000,000 empty chairs remained, and families mourned, and civilizations grieved for those who had chosen to become something else to save everyone else. Yet life continued, and the alliance forged in desperation became something permanent as human and Aethery colonies began intermingling. Sarah Bennett married KL in a ceremony that combined traditions from both species, and children learned history from both cultures. Jake and Lyra were married 1 year after the war ended in a ceremony held on the world in the Shroud under the watchful presence of the Transcendent Guardians. Ember served as both honor guard and officiant, and her psychic voice pronounced them bound in ways that honored both their peoples and their sacrifice. On their wedding night, standing under alien stars that now belonged to both their species, Lyra took Jake's hand and asked if he remembered when they first met. Jake said he remembered thinking she had the most terrifying dragon he had ever seen, and Lyra started to correct him, automatically then laughed. She grew serious, and said that small kindness of sharing food had changed everything, and one meal freely given became the seed from which their entire alliance grew. Jake said, maybe that was the lesson, which was that grand destinies begin with small choices, and saving the galaxy starts with sharing lunch with someone who needs it. Ember presence wrapped around them both and said the architects had sought perfection but failed because they forgot that imperfection and weakness and kindness were not flaws but features. She said Jake was different because he chose compassion when extinction would have been easier, and that choice echoed across stars and changed everything. In the years that followed, the Human-Aethery Alliance became a beacon for other species, and they taught the lessons learned at terrible cost. They taught that survival requires adaptation and power demands responsibility, and sometimes the only way to remain truly alive is to care about others' survival more than your own comfort. A statue erected at the terminus line had a simple inscription saying, 1 million gave all so billions could live, and they were different every one, and may we honor their choice by being different too. On quiet nights when cosmic winds blew right, those who knew how to listen claimed they could hear singing from the stars. It was 1 million voices harmonized in a song of sacrifice and hope, and understanding that true strength lies not in weapons, but in willingness to share what little you have. The war was over, and the real work of building a future worth the sacrifice was just beginning. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Alliance station 5 years after the war ended, and he watched ships coming and going from both human and aethery worlds. The station orbited the planet Earth, and it served as the headquarters for the permanent Human-Aethery Alliance, and represented everything they had built together after the sacrifice of 1 million souls. Lyra joined him at the window, and her hand found his automatically after years of marriage, and she looked out at the busy space lanes with satisfaction. They had spent 5 years helping to rebuild what the war had damaged, and creating new bonds between their peoples, and the work was far from finished, but progress was clear. Human children now learned Aethery language and history in schools, while Aethery young ones studied human culture and resilience, and both species were better for it. Mixed crews served on ships throughout the Alliance, and marriages between humans and Aethery were becoming common, and the next generation would be the first to grow up knowing both species as family. Sarah Bennett and Kale ran a joint training academy where human pilots and Aethery dragon riders learned from each other, and their graduates were the finest in known space. Admiral Cross had retired the previous year and passed command of the fleet to Commander Fisher, who had proven herself. During the battle at Terminus Line, the Shroud of Souls had become a sacred place, where people from both species made pilgrimages to honor the 1 million who had sacrificed themselves. Jake and Lyra visited often because they felt responsible for those who had volunteered, and they wanted to ensure their sacrifice was never forgotten. Ember had become something of a legend among both species, and young Stardrakes looked up to her as the first to bond with the idea of true alliance. She spent much of her time now teaching both human and Aethery children about the importance of cooperation and understanding across differences. The transcendent guardians who had been the volunteers could sometimes be sensed in the Shroud, and they seemed content with their choice. Jake often wondered what it was like for them existing as pure consciousness woven into space itself, and whether they had any regrets about their decision. Lyra always said she thought they were happy because they had chosen their fate freely, and their choice had meaning beyond anything a normal life could provide. The device called the Null Engine remained where it was, in the Shroud, guarded carefully because both species agreed it should never be used again unless absolutely necessary. They had built monitoring stations around the dead planet to ensure no one could access the weapon without authorization from both species leaders. Jake thought about how much had changed since that day he found Lyra crashed on Threshold 7, with Ember coiled protectively around her damaged ship. One shared meal between strangers had grown into an alliance that now included 47 human colonies and 12 Aethery refuge worlds that had been rebuilt. The populations were recovering slowly, with humanity numbering 15 billion and growing, while the Aethery had climbed back to nearly 5 million. It was still a huge disparity, but the Aethery were no longer facing extinction, and their culture was being preserved and shared with humanity. New Aethery cities rose on restored worlds, combining their traditional architecture with human engineering, and the results were beautiful beyond description. Human colonies incorporated Aethery biotechnology into their infrastructure, creating sustainable cities that grew with the land instead of consuming it. The exchange of knowledge had led to breakthroughs in medicine and engineering and energy production, that benefited both species enormously. Stardrakes now bonded with select humans who showed the right temperament and mental discipline, and these partnerships were honored by both cultures. Jake and Lyra had become symbols of the alliance, and their story was taught to children as an example of how small acts of kindness could change everything. They traveled frequently, giving speeches and visiting colonies and encouraging continued cooperation between the species. But today was special because they were about to make an announcement that would shape the future of the Alliance in ways few could imagine. Admiral Fisher appeared on the holographic display and said everything was ready, and the delegates from both species were assembled in the main conference hall. Jake and Lyra made their way to the hall where representatives from every human colony and every aethery world waited to hear what they had to say. The room fell silent as they entered, and Jake could feel the weight of expectation from everyone present, because they knew something important was coming. Lyra spoke first, explaining that over the past 5 years both species had proven they could work together and build something greater than either could achieve alone. She said the alliance had been forged in war, but it had grown into something more in peace, and now it was time to take the next step. Jake continued, saying they were proposing a formal union between humanity and the aethery. Not just an alliance, but a true federation with shared government and shared purpose. The announcement caused a stir among the delegates, and some looked excited while others looked uncertain, and a few looked outright opposed. A human delegate from the outer colonies stood and asked if this meant giving up human sovereignty and independence. An aethery counselor asked if this meant abandoning the eternal code and traditions that had guided their people for millennia. Lyra answered that it meant neither giving up who they were nor abandoning their values, but instead creating something new that honored both heritages. Jake added that the Federation would have representation from both species equally, and decisions would require consensus, and no one would be forced to join. He said colonies and worlds that wanted to remain independent could do so, but they believed most would see the benefits of deeper cooperation. The debate that followed lasted hours with passionate arguments on both sides, and Jake and Lyra listened to every concern and answered every question. Slowly, the mood in the room shifted, as delegates realized this was not about domination by either species, but about partnership on a fundamental level. A vote was called, and when the results came in, 73% of human colonies and 81% of aethery worlds supported the Federation proposal. The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Jake felt Lyra squeeze his hand as tears ran down her face. Because they had done it. The Human Aethery Federation was born that day, and it represented a new chapter in galactic history, where two species chose unity over division. In the months that followed, a constitutional convention drafted the founding documents of the Federation. Incorporating principles from both species' legal traditions, they created a bicameral legislature with one house representing population and another representing worlds, ensuring both humans and aethery had meaningful voice. They established courts that blended human concepts of justice with aethery ideas of restoration and balance. They built a military structure that combined human tactical flexibility with aethery strategic wisdom and technological sophistication. And they created educational systems that taught children from both species to see themselves as part of one civilization, with two complementary cultures. Jake and Lyra were offered leadership positions in the new government, but they declined, saying their role was to inspire, not to govern. Instead, they continued traveling and speaking, and helping communities navigate the challenges of integration. Ember became the official guardian of the Shroud, and the keeper of memory for the 1 million who had sacrificed themselves. She ensured that every child in the Federation learned about the volunteers and understood that their peace had been purchased with lives freely given. On the 10th anniversary of the war end, Jake and Lyra returned to Threshold 7, where everything had started. The Red Plains where Lyra's ship had crashed now held a memorial garden with plants from both Earth and Aetheron growing together. They walked through the garden, hand in hand, remembering that first meeting when Jake had offered food to a stranger and changed the course of history. Lyra said she often wondered what would have happened if Jake had followed protocol and shot first instead of offering kindness. Jake said he did not think about alternate timelines because the choice he made had felt right in the moment, and he would make it again. They sat on a bench in the garden and watched the twin suns set just as they had on that first day, and Ember joined them, her massive form settling nearby. Ember's mental voice touched both their minds, saying, "You were different then, and you remain different now because you chose compassion over fear." She said that choice rippled outward, touching millions of lives, and creating possibilities that would never have existed otherwise. Jake thought about the 1 million volunteers and the billions now living in peace, and the children being born into a galaxy where cooperation was normal. He thought about Sarah and Kale and their mixed crew academy, and the Stardrake-bonded humans flying alongside A3 warriors. He thought about the cities being built, and the knowledge being shared, and the future being created one day at a time. Lyra leaned against him and said she was grateful every day that it had been him, found her, and that he had been different enough to see her as someone worth helping. Jake replied that she had been different too because she had trusted him despite having every reason not to, and together they had built something neither could have imagined. As darkness fell over Threshold 7, they could see stars appearing in the sky, and among them were ships from the Federation carrying people and goods and ideas. The galaxy was healing and growing and changing, and at the center of it all was a simple truth that had started with one shared meal. Kindness was not weakness, and compassion was not foolishness, and choosing to help instead of harm could change everything. Jake Morrison had shared his food with an alien princess, and she had said he was different. And together they had proven that being different, being willing to break rules and cross boundaries and choose hope over fear, was exactly what the universe needed. The story that began with a crash landing and a shared ration bar had become legend, but for Jake and Lyra, it was just their life. They had fought a war, and made impossible choices, and witnessed 1 million souls transform into something greater. They had built an alliance and a federation, and a future where human and Aethery children played together without seeing difference as division. And it had all started because one person chose kindness over protocol, and another person chose trust over suspicion. As they left the memorial garden and headed back to their ship, Jake looked at Lyra and smiled. He said he was glad he had shared his food with her all those years ago. She smiled back and said she was glad she had sat beside him and told him he was different. Because that difference, that choice to be kind in a universe that often rewarded cruelty, had saved billions of lives and created a civilization worth fighting for. The stars shone above them, eternal and cold but filled with warmth because of what they had built. And somewhere in the shroud, 1 million voices sang in harmony, celebrating not their sacrifice, but the future it had created. A future where being different meant being better, and where two species had learned that together they could accomplish anything. The end was also a beginning, and the story would continue as long as people remembered that small acts of kindness can change the universe.